The War on Terror, also known as the Global War on Terrorism, refers to the international military campaign that started after the September 11 attacks on the United States. U.S. President George W. Bush first used the term War on Terror on the 20th of September 2001. The Bush administration and the Western media have since used the term to argue a global military, political, legal, and conceptual struggle against both organizations designated terrorist and regimes accused of supporting them. It was originally used with a particular focus on countries associated with Islamic terrorism organizations, including Al-Qaeda and like-minded organizations. In 2013, President Barack Obama announced that the United States was no longer pursuing a war on terror, as the military focus should be on specific enemies rather than a tactic. He stated, "We must define our effort not as a boundless, global war on terror, but rather as a series of persistent, targeted efforts to dismantle specific networks of violent extremists that threaten America." Etymology. The phrase, war on terror, has been used to specifically refer to the ongoing military campaign led by the US, UK and their allies against organizations and regimes identified by them as terrorist, and excludes other independent counter-terrorist operations and campaigns such as those by Russia and India. The conflict has also been referred to by names other than the War on Terror. It has also been known as World War III, World War IV, Bush's War on Terror, the Long War, the Global War on Terror, the War against Al-Qaeda. History of the name. In 1984, the Reagan administration used the term war against terrorism as part of an effort to pass legislation that was designed to freeze assets of terrorist groups and marshal the forces of government against them. Author Shane Harris asserts this was a reaction to the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, which killed 241 U.S. and 58 French peacekeepers. The concept of America at war with terrorism may have begun on the 11th of September 2001 when Tom Brokaw, having just witnessed the collapse of one of the towers of the World Trade Center, declared, "Terrorists have declared war on America." On the 16th of September 2001, at Camp David, President George W. Bush used the phrase war on terrorism in an unscripted and controversial comment when he said, "This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while." Bush later apologized for this remark due to the negative connotations the term crusade has to people, e.g., of Muslim faith. The word crusade was not used again. On the 20th of September 2001, during a televised address to a joint session of Congress, Bush stated that, war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. In April 2007, the British government announced publicly that it was abandoning the use of the phrase war on terror, as they found it to be less than helpful. This was explained more recently by Lady Eliza Manning Buller. In her 2011 Reith lecture, the former head of MI5 said that the 9/11 attacks were a crime, not an act of war. "So I never felt it helpful to refer to a war on terror." U.S. President Barack Obama has rarely used the term, but in his inaugural address on the 20th of January 2009, he stated, "Our nation is at war against a far-reaching network of violence and hatred." In March 2009, the Defense Department officially changed the name of operations from Global War on Terror to Overseas Contingency Operation. In March 2009, the Obama administration requested that Pentagon staff members avoid use of the term, instead using Overseas Contingency Operation. Basic objectives of the Bush administration war on terror, such as targeting Al-Qaeda and building international counter-terrorism alliances, remain in place. In December 2012, J.E.H. Johnson, the General Counsel of the Department of Defense, stated that the military fight will be replaced by a law enforcement operation when speaking at Oxford University. predicting that Al-Qaeda will be so weakened to be ineffective, and has been effectively destroyed, and thus the conflict will not be an armed conflict under international law. In May 2013, Obama stated that the goal is to dismantle specific networks of violent extremists that threaten America, which coincided with the U.S. Office of Management and Budget having changed the wording from overseas contingency operations to countering violent extremism in 2010. The rhetorical war on terror, because the actions involved in the war on terrorism are diffuse, and the criteria for inclusion are unclear. Political theorist Richard Jackson has argued that the war on terrorism, therefore, is simultaneously a set of actual practices, wars, covert operations, agencies, and institutions, and an accompanying series of assumptions, beliefs, justifications, and narratives. It is an entire language or discourse. Jackson cites among many examples a statement by John Ashcroft that the attacks of September 11 drew a bright line of demarcation between the civil and the savage. Administration officials also described terrorists as hateful, treacherous, barbarous, mad, twisted, perverted, without faith, parasitical, inhuman, and, most commonly, evil. Americans, in contrast, were described as brave, loving, generous, strong, resourceful, heroic, and respectful of human rights. Both the term and the policies it denotes have been a source of ongoing controversy. As critics argue, it has been used to justify unilateral preventive war, human rights abuses and other violations of international law. Background. Precursor to the 11th of September attacks, the origins of Al-Qaeda can be traced to the Soviet war in Afghanistan. The United States, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the People's Republic of China supported the Islamist Afghan Mujahideen guerrillas against the military forces of the Soviet Union and the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. A small number of Afghan Arab volunteers joined the fight against the Soviets, including Osama bin Laden, but there is no evidence they received any external assistance. In May 1996, the group World Islamic Front for Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders, sponsored by bin Laden, started forming a large base of operations in Afghanistan, where the Islamist extremist regime of the Taliban had seized power earlier in the year. In February 1998, Osama bin Laden signed a fatwa, as head of Al-Qaeda, declaring war on the West and Israel. Later in May of that same year, Al-Qaeda released a video declaring war on the U.S. and the West. On 7 August 1998, Al-Qaeda struck the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing 224 people, including 12 Americans. In retaliation, U.S. President Bill Clinton launched Operation Infinite Reach, a bombing campaign in Sudan and Afghanistan against targets the U.S. asserted were associated with WIFJAJC, although others have questioned whether a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan was used as a chemical warfare plant. The plant produced much of the region's anti-malarial drugs and around 50% of Sudan's pharmaceutical needs. The strikes failed to kill any leaders of WIFJAJC or the Taliban. Next came the 2000 Millennium Attack plots, which included an attempted bombing of Los Angeles International Airport. On 12 October 2000, the Uskal bombing occurred near the port of Yemen, and 17 U.S. Navy sailors were killed. The 11th of September 2001 attacks. On the morning of the 11th of September 2001, 19 Islamic men affiliated with Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airliners all bound for California. Once the hijackers assumed control of the airliners, they told the passengers that they had the bomb on board and would spare the lives of passengers and crew once their demands were met. No passenger and crew actually suspected that they would use the airliners as suicide weapons, since it had never happened before in history. The hijackers, members of Al-Qaeda's Hamburg cell, intentionally crashed two airliners into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, New York, killing the 147 civilians and the 10 hijackers on board the airliners. Both buildings collapsed within 2 hours from fire damage related to the crashes, destroying nearby buildings and damaging others, and killing 2,192 civilians, 71 law enforcement officers, and 343 firefighters who were in the towers and on the ground. The hijackers crashed a third airliner into the Pentagon in Arlington County, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., killing 70 civilians and 55 military personnel who were in the building, as well as 59 civilians and the 5 hijackers on board. 39 civilians, a law enforcement officer, and 4 hijackers died when the fourth plane crashed into O Field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after some of its passengers and flight crew attempted to retake control of the plane, which the hijackers had redirected toward Washington, D.C., to target the White House, or the U.S. Capitol. No flights had survivors. A total of 2,977 victims and 19 hijackers perished in the attacks, making it the worst terrorist attack to ever take place on U.S. soil and also the deadliest foreign attack on U.S. soil since the Japanese carried out a surprise air raid on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941. U.S. objectives. The Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Terrorists, or AUMF, was made law on 14 September 2001, to authorize the use of United States Armed Forces against those responsible for the attacks on the 11th of September 2001. It authorized the President to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on the 11th of September 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons, in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations or persons. Congress declares this is intended to constitute specific statutory authorization within the meaning of Section 5 of the War Powers Resolution of 1973. The George W. Bush administration defined the following objectives in the War on Terror: defeat terrorists such as Osama bin Laden, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and demolish their organizations. Identify, locate and demolish terrorists along with their organizations. Deny sponsorship, support and sanctuary to terrorists. End the state sponsorship of terrorism. Establish and maintain an international standard of accountability with regard to combating terrorism. Strengthen and sustain the international effort to combat terrorism. Work with willing and able states. Enable weak states, persuade reluctant states, compel unwilling states. Interdict and disorder material support for terrorists. Abolish terrorist sanctuaries and havens. Diminish the underlying conditions that terrorists seek to exploit. Partner with the international community to strengthen weak states and prevent emergence of terrorism. Win the war of ideals. Defend U.S. citizens and interests at home and abroad. Integrate the national strategy for homeland security. Attain domain awareness. Enhance measures to ensure the integrity, reliability, and availability of critical, physical, and information-based infrastructures at home and abroad. Implement measures to protect U.S. citizens abroad. Ensure an integrated incident management capability.